Okay, hello and welcome to the National Review Institute and Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation's Putin's War Crimes in Ukraine webinar. I'm Ken Pope, the Director of Academic Programs for VOC, and it's my privilege to introduce today's moderator for our event, Jay Nordlinger. He's a senior editor for the National Review Institute, a fellow at the National Review Institute, and he writes for a variety of subjects, including politics, foreign affairs, and the arts. He is the music critic of the New Criterion, and since 2002, he's hosted a series of public interviews at the Salzburg Festival. He writes a column called Impromptuous for nationalreview.com and is the host of two podcasts, Q&A and Music for a While. Before I turn it over to Jay, our apologies for the technical difficulties that we've had, but we should have a good event. So Jay, over to you.
Will that do it, maybe?
There you go.
All right, Ken. Thank you so much. And thanks to one and all for your patience, technical difficulties. As we used to say, as they said in the old days of television, the difficulties remain, but it's good to be on the air. And I will turn things over right now to the president of National Review Institute, Lindsay Craig. NRI is, you might say, the parent organization of National Review magazine. NRI, like NR, was founded by William F. Buckley Jr., and NRI does a great variety of activities, and it's a pleasure to work in collaboration in a good sense, with VOC. And Lindsay Craig is our president of NRI, and I believe she should be appearing soon.
Hello. Well, thank you so much, Jay, and thank you so much, Ken. We are really pleased to be co-hosting this with Victims of Communism Memorial because this is a very important time, obviously, in our history. But we as an institution want to say we have been standing against tyranny since 1955. We have always been against totalitarian aggression, and we are against it today. Victims of Communism is a fantastic organization, and Lee Edwards says one of the reasons why it was founded was that we can remind people never to forget. Unfortunately, I think that we have found ourselves in a time where maybe we kind of forgot that there could be this kind of aggression, very overt aggression in 2022. But fortunately, there's a lot of great minds that have good solutions. And we feel that it is important that we re-emphasize America's leadership in US foreign policy. And so we are going to be dedicated to having several forums like this in the next coming months. And so we hope you all enjoy today's forum and will join us for the ones that are coming up. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. We get on with the program.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, Lee Edwards has been thinking about these issues for a very long time, studying them, writing about them. Lee is, I would say, an historian of the Cold War. He is a biographer. He is, I would say, an all-purpose political writer. He has held institutional positions. He is a co-founder of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. I believe his title is Chairman Emeritus now, but I consider Lee Edwards a man for all seasons. And we were talking before this program began about how so many things that were old are new again, and in a ghastly way. So this is a time for expertise such as Lee Edwards has. And I will now mute myself and listen with everyone else to Lee Edwards of VOC.
Well, thank you, Jay. And I'm hoping that everybody can hear me. Looking at what's happening over in Ukraine right now, I'd like to put the following argument to you. I believe that you cannot separate the war between Ukraine and Russia from the deadly legacy of Marxism-Leninism. I think that we must ask, what were the bitter fruits of Marxism-Leninism? Well, Eugene Lyons, a distinguished American journalist who was based in Moscow for almost a decade, calculated that no regime in history had initiated more deprivation, terror, fear, misery, and death than Soviet Russia. Consider the following: more than 100 million deaths around the world, systematic purges, show trials, and firing squads, starvation and famines, forced labor and so-called re-education camps, unremitting propaganda and agitation. So happens that a leading Russian historian writing about 17th century Russia indicted it with this telling phrase: the state swelled and the people shrank. That very same is true of present day Russia and its perpetual president, Vladimir Putin. We cannot understand Putin until we understand that he was trained by the KGB, an instrument of Marxism-Leninism. Putin's invasion of the Ukraine was inevitable, given his 15 formative years in the KGB. Consider, for a Marxist, war within nations and between nations is inevitable. Karl Marx, the great founding father of Marxism-Leninism, said, war is the midwife of revolutions. And Vladimir Lenin himself, the original Bolshevik, agreed, writing, great historical questions can be solved only by violence. Mao Zedong, whom Putin surely read, wrote, quote, every communist must grasp that political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. In fact, we can say that the whole world can be remodeled only with a gun. This is the Marxist-Leninist ideology that molded Vladimir Putin. And therefore, we can only deal effectively with him, with Mr. Putin, if we accept how much he is in thrall to Marxism-Leninism and the core idea that political power grows only out of the barrel of a gun. So that's my contribution, Jay, to our discussion. And I now turn it over to you to go with our other talkers and speakers here this afternoon.
Lee, before going on to the next one, I'd like to ask you a question. Do you think that what you say about the current Russian government is widely enough understood? For many years, when I have criticized Putin and the current Kremlin, I've been told, well, today's Russia is not the Soviet Union, you know. And my usual response has been, oh, I know that. But does Putin? Because sometimes it's hard to tell. Vladimir Kara-Murza, the Russian democracy leader, is now a political prisoner. But I did a podcast with him not long ago, and he made the point that today's Russia, there are more political prisoners than there were in the late Soviet period. So I just wonder whether the nature of Putin's regime is widely enough understood in our country, the United States, even now with this savagery in Ukraine. Because if that didn't wake people up, it's hard to imagine what might.
Well, I think there is no other way to explain the kind of savagery, to use your word, Jay, and the kind of all-out totalitarian war which the Russians are conducting right now against Ukraine, except to refer back to the ideology which still motivates the top leadership, and which I think motivates Vladimir Lenin, Vladimir Putin. As I say, well, actually, he is Lenin, and an updated Lenin, that here is a man who was trained for 15 years in the KGB. That was all he knew in the very important formative years in his 30s and 40s and into his early 50s. You cannot, it seems to me, explain his conduct, his disregard for life, his apparent love of violence, unless you go back and take a look and see what Lenin said and practiced, unless you can see what Karl Marx dictated and urged upon his followers. And to me, that makes so much of what is going on make sense. And I think also, Jay, that we cannot be fooled by some of the trappings, if you will, of capitalism run amok there in Russia. That because that the thinking of the leadership, particularly by Mr. Putin, is that which is taken right from Lenin's Marxist-Leninist book.
Thank you so much, Lee Edwards. We'll now hear from Elizabeth Edwards Spalding. I'll do a brief introduction. She is a historian, an historian of the Cold War in particular. She is taught widely. She is the vice chairman of VOC, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, and is the founding director of its museum, which I believe opens next month. And again, more expertise pertinent to the hour, unfortunately, but we need the expertise. And those old things are all too new and before us. And here is Elizabeth Edwards Spalding. Good to meet you, by the way.
Good to meet you too, Jay. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you all and with the National Review Institute, our friends at NRI. So now I have to get sober. Should we be surprised? Vladimir Putin, as we've already started to hear, was formed by the Soviet Union and came up through the KGB ranks. He is a creature of the Soviet regime, the Communist Party, and the Committee for State Security. The regime and party were not only communist, but also corrupt. Everything had to serve or be made to serve the state and the party. The KGB, that's the Committee for State Security, was the secretive intelligence gathering, both domestic and international, and state security enforcement arm of the Communist Party. It relied on, it even embodied terror, violence, fear, and subversion. All elements, regime, party, and enforcement, were based in lies. That was Putin's world. It was a world enabled and propped up by a vast, mighty military with many nuclear weapons. Together, regime, party, enforcement, and military comprised the Soviet way of warfare. And then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. Putin called that collapse the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Should we be surprised? There is a long, sad history of outsider control, even colonization of Ukraine, which has a rich heritage of its own. After Russia, Ukraine is the largest country on the European continent. Except for the Carpathian Mountains in the southwest, Ukraine lacks natural borders. In fact, Ukraine means borderland in both Russian and Polish. Parts of Ukraine have been ruled by Russia, Lithuania, Poland, and Hungary over the centuries. But during that same time, Ukraine understood itself as a people. It had its own identity, though not its own state. There were hopeful moments for Ukrainian independence in the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. But Russia ruled Ukraine at this time. Then the world wars and the Bolsheviks came, and Soviet domination outdid all its predecessors. And that's saying a lot, since Nazi domination did some of its worst work in Ukraine. The Soviets took governmental, economic, social, and cultural control of Ukraine. It was full-scale occupation and totalitarian control. It was always war. There was no peacetime. There were crimes of all types, including what we now call war crimes, crimes against humanity, and some would also say genocide. Some historical context will help us better understand today. World War I turned Ukraine into a battleground between Russia Austria-Hungary, and Germany. You can think of it as the frontier between Eastern and Western Europe, with gates swinging each way. Individual leaders and political parties tried for a government based on a combination of Ukrainian nationalism and culture, liberalism, and socialism. It ended up being a short-lived revolution in 1917. The Bolsheviks became involved and battles ensued over Ukraine, largely between Soviet Russia and Poland. Although the communists were thrown back more than once and were defeated in Poland, Ukraine was then divided among Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, and Soviet Russia. In Soviet Ukraine, the people were enslaved and their land taken in the name of communism. Soviet Ukraine suffered greatly. Under war communism, Lenin's policies nationalized all enterprises, took food, and caused famine. At least 1 million lives were claimed in the Soviet state-made famine of the early 1920s. Just as Ukraine was recovering, the Soviets, now under Stalin, doubled down on forced industrialization and collectivization. A special target in the late 1920s were kulaks, who were deemed a class of their own as supposedly wealthy peasants. Typically, it meant these farmers were doing well enough to provide for their families and to trade or sell excess crops. The communists had a name for their murderous policy, dekulakization. This process included extremely high taxes, quotas to deliver grain, and deportation of thousands, perhaps 100,000 or more families to Siberia and Kazakhstan. And the communists imposed this process in Ukraine and elsewhere in the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, as elsewhere, they aimed to destroy mainstays of the culture, the individual, the church, the peasant, and the village. Now, all of this led to an almost unbelievable chapter in the 1930s. And I say almost unbelievable, but because communists enact their ideological warfare wherever they go, it ultimately is believable. It's just very hard to comprehend. Many Ukrainians continue to resist collectivization. The Soviet Union deliberately went after Ukraine and its people, its rich land, its grain. The communists turned the breadbasket of Europe into worse than a basket case. Soviet policies caused famine, horrible famine, and Stalin did not care. In fact, he ordered it. This was Holodomor, which means death by hunger. The technical dates are 1932 and 1933, but the negative effects of many types from this famine lasted for years. Forced collectivization set high quotas that were impossible to meet. As punishment, then the Soviet authorities confiscated even the seed and grain, in addition to levying fines. Farmers were not allowed to leave their villages. Ukrainians were not allowed to leave their country. They were entombed. As famine spread, cannibalism followed. And by the end of 1933, between 2 and 5 million Ukrainians had died due to Stalin's communist-made famine. In recent years, scholars have settled on a number of 4 million, give or take. And this same state-imposed famine killed outside Ukraine too. As many as 2 million more died elsewhere in the USSR. It took years to return to normal. Could life return to normal? Think of the direct as well as indirect costs. The communists denied the existence of the Holodomor. Ukrainians were punished, including being sent to the Gulag if they spoke, wrote, sang, or painted about it. They were not even allowed to remember their dead, to grieve, to mourn, or even to name and count them. The Soviet part of Ukraine was then victimized again as part of the Great Terror later in the 1930s. Stalin's purges are typically attributed to his personality cult and drive for power, but they also constituted warfare on his own peoples. Ukrainians, among many others, were falsely accused and arrested, tortured, subjected to show trials, executed, deported, and sent to the Gulag. A hot war, World War II, inflicted more crimes on Ukraine. Western Ukraine came under Soviet rule after the joint invasion of Poland by Germany and the USSR at the start of World War II. In the part of Ukraine that the Red Army occupied, Sovietization of all areas was imposed, along with arrests of anyone who resisted. More than 1 million people were deported to Siberia and other points east by mid-1941. Perhaps you know about the Katyn Forest massacre. This was not a practice restricted to Poles. Hardly known at all is what the Soviets did in and to Ukraine. The NKVD prison massacres in Western Ukraine came in 1941, after the Germans broke the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and invaded the USSR. The NKVD, which is an earlier iteration of the KGB, brutally murdered between 10,000 and 40,000 political prisoners in Western Ukraine over the course of 8 days. About 70% of the victims were Ukrainian, 20% were Polish, and the rest were Jews and other nationalities. Some had been found guilty of major crimes, while others were being held for lesser crimes or just for questioning. Depending on the prison, some victims were shot in the back of the neck, while others were burned alive in locked cells. But it was all systematic. Many endured brutal torture before they were killed. The Soviets again committed mass murder, again denied, and again blamed the Nazis. By 1943, the Germans were losing ground in Ukraine. The Soviet Red Army recaptured Kyiv and repressed Ukraine again. Stalin and his men went after anyone they suspected of being disloyal or of collaborating with the Nazis. They were able to take all of Ukraine this time. Plus, they forcibly deported the Crimean Tatars. Now, under complete Soviet domination, matters did not improve for Ukrainians after World War II. There was no peacetime for them. Forced industrialization meant individuals suffered. Pre-war levels of production in agriculture were not reached again until the 1960s. Another famine resulting from communist policies, post-war dislocations, and drought claimed about 1 million lives in 1946 and 1947. At the same time, the communists continued to persecute various religious faiths and forcibly liquidated the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, which then went underground for decades. The crimes and denial of them continued. They do not include the ongoing repression of Ukrainian dissidents, educators, intellectuals, priests, writers, artists, and nationalists. Basically anyone who did not want to be communist, who did not want to be Sovietized. In Moscow's view, these were the same. The denial part is not all ancient history. The disaster at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was denied for weeks in 1986, and that was under Gorbachev, not Stalin, not Khrushchev, not Brezhnev. It was the worst nuclear accident in history. And in addition to deaths right away and over time, contaminated agricultural lands near Chernobyl will remain unsafe for perhaps thousands of years. And now, of course, it is all part of the hot war, the battlefield that is Ukraine. In 1990 and 1991, Ukraine led the way to independence for the former republics of the Soviet Union. Ukraine established itself as a fully independent state. Soviet warfare against Ukraine officially ended. In 1994, Ukraine agreed to return the thousands of nuclear weapons on its territory to Russia. A major stipulation agreed to by Russia was the guarantee of Ukraine's territory and sovereignty. Yet Russia has violated this agreement, this guarantee, more than once, notably in its illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, and this year, obviously, in its invasion of and attack on Ukraine. In its current war on Ukraine, Russia's atrocities are found on the common lists of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and if you go with the original meaning before the Soviets narrowed it in the 1940s, genocide. Russia is committing grave crimes in Ukraine against Ukrainians. Russia is not engaged in a just war. It is not a justified war. It was an invasion, an unprovoked attack. It was and is built on disinformation. Russia does not accept Ukraine. Should we be surprised? Neither did the USSR. And for today, as for the past, it matters not only what goes on in Ukraine, but also what goes on outside Ukraine. experts across the political spectrum have been saying that Ukraine has changed the world, that it has changed global politics. No, it has revealed them. Everything is not sweetness and light in international relations. Regime distinctions matter. Peace through strength is timeless and needed. Ukraine, and notice we say one word and everyone understands what that encompasses, has reawakened the West. At some point in the 20-teens, few, if any, young people knew what the West meant. Now everyone does. That's a good thing. The West stands for civilization, the rule of law, and freedom, and against war crimes. Thank you, Jay.
Well, thank you so much. We have heard from Elizabeth Edwards Spalding, and I must say that it was so refreshing, despite the topic, to hear such clarity in an age when so much is fogged up and deliberately fogged up. Well, at this point, we were to hear from Andy Milburn, the retired Marine Corps colonel. He is unable to join us because of technical problems. He's willing to join us, but there are technical difficulties. But we're going to proceed with our discussion. And if Ken Pope is in the neighborhood, so to speak, the Zoom neighborhood, if you could zoom in, sir.
Zoomed.
Thank you. And I thought we'd just have a discussion with the four of us. And Ken, awkward as it may be, would you mind introducing yourself and giving people some of your background before we move on? I'd like hearing it myself.
Sure. So I'll just start with a brief intro. So I'm a retired Army officer, spent my time working in basically three different fields. Those were all on the collection side for intel. So as reconnaissance officer, worked in the special operations field for a bit, and then as a Russian foreign area officer. I served numerous assignments in Eastern Europe, a couple in Ukraine, traveled all over Russia, and had a very interesting experience pertinent to this conversation. Had the opportunity to deploy with the Russian Airborne Battalion to Kosovo about 20 years ago. It's hard to believe it's been that long now, and worked with those guys and lived with them for about 5 months. So again, that is my background. Joined VOC after working in academia a bit, teaching intelligence and national security studies. So that's my background on this particular topic. Again, familiar with the Russian military, obviously. I'm a poor substitute for Andy Milburn, who was on the ground in Kyiv doing the Lord's work there, trying to help the Ukrainian military build. So I'll answer the questions to the best of my ability and talk to you about what I know and what I've seen with the Russian military.
Thank you, Ken. I'm glancing at my notes here. I'll say a few words, then ask people to respond in whatever way they like. I do a lot of writing in this field. I write a great deal about, well, the communist world, about Russia, about freedom, democracy, human rights, tyranny, all that stuff. But I will make a confession, since it's just us and no one else listening. I don't read a lot of the articles. The headlines are enough for me, because these atrocities, these depredations never change. Time and place don't matter. It's all the same. In China, the Soviet Union, Sudan, Ethiopia, Cuba, North Korea, on and on. All the torture, all the murder, all the rape, all the sadism in its various forms never really changes. I want to quote a State Department official, Beth Van Schaak. She was testifying at the UN, and she said this: "We saw violence of a different order." She's talking about Ukraine. "This was interpersonal violence. Credible reports of individuals killed execution style, with their hands bound, bodies showing signs of torture, horrific accounts of sexual violence against women and girls. We mean rape, might as well call it what it is. We now have credible information that a Russian military unit operating in the vicinity of Donetsk executed Ukrainians who were attempting to surrender rather than take them into custody, so on and so forth. People standing in bread lines, just murdered. Women and children trying to evacuate, murdered." And I very much sympathized with something that Mitt Romney said. Obviously, this is a war. there are two sides and they're shooting each other. I know it's a war. But more than a war, it seems like an assault by one government on a people, on a country. And place names such as Bucha and Irpin, well, they should enter history as infamous names, right? Where infamous things were done. The bombing of that theater in Mariupol, it's sometimes atrocities are so, well, they're so numerous and so vast. It's better to focus on specific acts because the whole is a little bit gauzy, you know. And this theater in Mariupol was serving as a bomb shelter, and Russian forces just destroyed the theater, killing at least 600 people. I understand this is war, but it seems to me more like butchery and an attempt to efface a nation and an identity, you know? And one more thing before I shut up, because I've thrown a lot at you. The Russian government and its supporters and apologists around the world say Nazi a lot. Ukrainian is practically a synonym in Russian propaganda for a Nazi. But when it comes to the behavior of Putin's forces, it seems terribly familiar, you know, from these, these twin ideologies of the 20th century, Nazism and communism. And Radek Sikorsky made, I thought, a very good point in a podcast with me. You recall the old slogan, I forget the order of it, one Reich, one leader, one people. Of whom is that true? The guy in the Kremlin or the guy in Kyiv? Anyway, I've rambled on about very dark things. And I wonder if I could ask Lee Edwards first to comment on anything in any way he wishes.
I had the opportunity to be in Kiev, Ukraine, in 1988. This was 1 year before the Berlin Wall came down, and some 3 years before the Soviet Union dissolved. And what struck us, we're there was a group of visiting journalists, was the Russification which still existed in Ukraine. At a press conference, the people were speaking Russian, not Ukraine. There was one gentleman there who said he had the most popular radio program in Kiev, and we said, "Well, what language do you say?" "Oh," he said, "Russian." So you could see. What about the textbooks? Well, there again, we were able to look at a couple of them, and this Russification had continued, as Dr. Spalding pointed out, since the beginning, since the Bolshevik Revolution, almost 70, 80 years. And yet, and here's my point, Jay, that I want to make, and yet the Ukrainian people have exhibited such extraordinary courage and resilience and determination, and have dumbfounded the Soviet generals, the Russian generals, who thought they could take Kiev and all the other major capitals so easily. What does that tell us? It seems to me it's something which is so clear, which becomes clearer with, you know, all the passing years and all the problems that we face, is that the love of and the desire for freedom beats within the breast of every one of us, regardless of our nationality, regardless of our race, of our color, of our religion. And I think it's that desire for freedom which is propelling, which is undergirding the Ukrainian people, an extraordinary act of courage and determination.
Elizabeth Edwards Spalding, are you going to be on the screen somewhere? See if there you are. Hello. You, in your remarks, I hate to refer to this so lightly, but you use the G word, genocide. And I must say that my rule is to stay out of these debates. We've been through this for decades with the Turks and the Armenians, and more recently, the Rohingyas in Burma, the Uyghurs in China. I say, call it what you want, just acknowledge it as mass murder and do all you can to stop it. But it seems to me that those who, well, you know who sounds genocidal? These Russian talkers on state media. They're sort of unblushing about it. So, of course, this is a great issue in Rwanda. You remember that some people in the Clinton administration were reluctant to declare what was happening genocide because it would necessitate certain actions. But for heaven's sakes, God, if there's not genocide in Ukraine, there's something that certainly passes for it, I would think. Do you care to say a few words on this worst of topics?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have to, right, Jay? And I think this was the thread I wanted to pull on when you said, and now you can respond to anything you want to. On one level, it does not matter. Call it mass murder. That's what it is. And these are all atrocities, right? But if you go back and you look at the meaning of genocide, even by the definition that ended up getting accepted, this narrower definition that focuses on race and tribe, we're getting to the point where this is genocide with respect to Ukraine and what Russia's wanting to do, trying to do, doing in part. Also, if you go back and you look at the origins of how genocide came to be defined, when people realized, okay, what happened in World War II was something. There were various people studying this, and Raphael Lemkin, the international lawyer who came up with the term genocide, he didn't mean for it to be so narrowly construed on race and tribe. He meant for it to be more like what we're seeing, going after a people, and they can be, more heterogeneous, but going after a particular people. And it was the Soviets at the time in the United Nations that didn't want it to be that definition. They worked at narrowing it. And that's why we have this more specific understanding of genocide that came about in the mid 1940s. And I think that's telling. And I think the Soviets knew at the time, if it were going to be the original definition, then they had already done genocide before World War II. And then they didn't want to, limit their possibilities for the future. And then again, now with Russia and the way many Russians are formed, not all, but what we've talked about with Putin is true for many of his supporters, then it is genocide. They're fine with doing that, right? The rest of us are appalled. This is against, these are mass murder and crimes against humanity, crimes that cry out to heaven, right? But it is genocide, and I do think perhaps a forum talking about it that way, just to walk through the history of how genocide came to be as a term, and what that means with respect to Ukraine today could be helpful, especially for I would say even millennials, but certainly Generation Z. They don't know they don't know enough to begin with, but they really don't know about this. So we need to educate on top of everything else.
I'd like to put to you a very, very sensitive question. Reagan taught many of us, always to separate the government from the people. And I'm very strict about this. So certainly in the early days, early weeks of the war, I said Putin, Putin over and over again. And I'm going to put my question to you in a very crude way. Is it a Putin thing or a Russian thing? John Bolton had a startling article in which he said, we'll be dealing with this question of Russia and Ukraine in 30 years, in 60 years, in 100 years. I don't know, but I find myself as a journalist, maybe I'm wrong, saying Putin less than I did in February and March, and Russia more. As I say, this is a very sensitive issue.
This is a sensitive issue. And I am somebody who has spent my entire career in teaching distinguishing between the leader and the people, especially when we're talking about the regime types and totalitarian regimes, because it is what's imposed on people. And I do think that Putin has imposed this on the Russian people. I think that we can't get accurate polling out of Russia. We know this, but we know that there are people who are resisting. Perhaps we're not getting accurate numbers, but to the point that we can tell what we're up, I think we're up over 20,000 or so people have been arrested.
Some of the bravest people on earth.
And we know that you already mentioned Vladimir Karamazov, but also others, and there's Navalny still talking about this from prison. He's becoming less and less of a, any problems anybody had with him at some point. Boy, he's really proved himself during this too. And I think we're at the point where I want to still say, because I don't see the evidence that it's Russia yet, unless the Russians know what's going on, and not all of them do, right? And then there are many who are resisting. We know they're getting arrested. If it's more than 20,000 that have been arrested or protesting, and then some of those getting arrested, that means there are more that feel that way who are not protesting. And we know Memorial, who's been so heroic at that group about cataloging and explaining the Soviet past. They were shut down by Putin. And that would have been the kind of organization that would have said, wait a minute, look what's going on now, and connect it to the past. So there's a systematic effort going on by Putin and his government to not let the facts get out, not let discussion get out. So I'm not willing to go as far as others. And I also share with Lee Edwards the notion that there is something inside us as human beings wanting what is good, what is free, what is right. And Putin has made other choices, and other people around him have too. But now, all that said, to go to your point here, if we had unlimited time, would I have talked more about how Putin is formed by being Russian too? Yes, he is. He's not just formed out of growing up under the Soviet experience. That itself has a Russian element. Each of the countries that has communism, even though it tries to, in some ways, take over the culture, obliterate it, replace it, create the new man, it ends up having to adapt to the culture that's there.
This was the great battle between Richard Pipes and Alexander Solzhenitsyn.
That's right.
There's the relationship between Russia and the Soviet Union. Well, ladies and gentlemen, just a note here. Our event was to be from 2 to 3. We began at 2:15, so we'll end at 3:15, just so you know. Ken, this colossal and formidable Russian military, I heard someone put it this way, they were pretty good at killing women and children from the air in Syria. And, they're pretty good at bombing theaters and women and children as they attempt to flee to Poland and so on. But up against the Ukrainian military, I must say some of the Ukrainians I've interviewed, and they're all involved in politics, most are the ones I've talked with, even they're surprised in an admiring way at how well their guys and their women are doing in the field. Of course, with Western help, maybe they need more. Would you comment on any aspect you like, Ken?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just take it from, I guess, the perspective. Let me see if you, I guess I'm on mute. Am I on mute? Okay, you got it.
Oh, you're good. You're good, Ken.
Okay. I would just say it's just a completely misunderstanding on the Russian side. So he completely underestimated the Ukrainians' will to fight. And the leader that was lurking in this former comedian called Zelensky, that he just didn't take him seriously. So I think they are just completely unprepared for what they thought. So we'll start with the Ukrainian military. So they, unlike the Russians, so Russia embarked on this program to enhance, to better train, to make their military more professional about 15 years ago. It clearly hasn't worked out too well for them. Ukrainians, on the other hand, after they lost Crimea for the last about 8 years, they've really absorbed a ton of US and NATO training. In addition, they've rotated about 400,000 troops in and out of the Donbass fight. So they have a well-trained combat experienced force that's fighting a largely conscript still Russian military. Especially that was very, very telling up in the north when they first came in near Kyiv and just were savaged by the Ukrainians, especially in some of these street fights that they've had in the cities. So urban warfare is the toughest form of warfare, and they were not doing well at it. The Ukrainians were. The Russians, so let's talk about those guys. So especially the north, they seem to have led with, again, those conscript troops. If you think about the US and how we train people to go into war like this, it takes about 2 years to get an infantry squad, infantry soldier ready to be effective and fight. It takes about 2 years to do that. These guys get 1 year of the conscripts, and that's who they led off with going in toward Kyiv, their big coup de grace punch they were going to try to do. So really wasn't very effective for them. Their equipment, fatally flawed. Their tanks, their APCs, they store their ammunition inside the turrets unprotected, and when it goes off, it's catastrophic. So the troops are not having any type of confidence in the equipment they have. That's why you see so much of it abandoned as well. So, and his super weapons don't appear to be too super. So again, he's not doing very well in that country. And I think it all goes back to, again, their system. It's not like us. Our military. It's not a professional force in the main still. And it is just something that these guys they just don't know how to do it at the appropriate level. And it's telling in their combat piece. I think the one thing I want to share with everybody, I think it's kind of the most telling piece about why we have the atrocities in the country now. It's an incredibly undisciplined force. And as such, they're very prone to creating these crimes. And it goes back to their system, not a system based on the rule of law or values like that we have in the West. So in combat, the job of leaders, Russian leaders and any other leader, is to manage violence in the worst possible environment. And as a result of their system, they don't have that. They don't have a strong NCO corps who takes care of that aspect of the fight. They don't allow the war crimes to take place to begin with. It's part of their culture. It's just not there like we have it in the West. So combine that with the fact they're losing, you're taking losses with your friends and you're seeing them die. The sense of I want revenge, or I want to take even more against these guys who my government has told me are Nazis, this plays into this cycle of building violence. That's what you're having there as you see it now in Ukraine. Kind of a long answer to your question, but
couple more, Ken. Of course, the Europeans are very important in all this. But let's talk briefly about the United States, because we're Americans and we care about our policy. Our response has been pretty good, is my impression. Would you like to critique it or endorse it, or what do you make of American behavior in this conflict?
I think it's gotten better. I think it's gotten much better than it was early on. I think for me, what would have been telling and had the most impact had we done it before the war started. Trying to get this gear and training and equipment into a force in the middle of a fight is very difficult at best. It's kind of amazing to me that Putin hasn't figured that out, how to choke off supplies getting into Ukraine. I think we're getting them the type of equipment they need now in the numbers that they need it, unlike what it was when it first started. I think the U.S., from the U.S. perspective, I think we thought they were going to fold. I mean, I think we underestimated the Ukrainians as well. So we didn't do this up front. I think one thing I would critique our approach is I think we see too much to Putin too early on. We don't. Anything he says, our mantra is, well, we don't want to escalate. We don't want to take a chance to, provoke him. Well, with a dictator, totalitarian, weakness or him hearing us say that is provoking an action to be more aggressive. I think the U.S. government would be better served in a lot of cases if we would just shut up and not tell him what we're going to do. Don't signal what we're going to do. Give him mystery where he's reacting to us for a change. We seem to be very reactive on our approach to him. again, getting the military stuff there has been beneficial, and we're doing a good job and much better as the day goes forward. But, we could have started out a little bit better. And I think we'd be, better served by not ceding him the initiative like we're doing all the time.
Yes. Ken, in our everyday parlance, we have this expression, to go nuclear. We say, oh man, he was so mad that he went nuclear. It could be literal in this case. I don't believe one of these things has been used since the summer of 1945. What if he does?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. What will the U.S. response be? I think he's using that as an intimidation tactic.
Yeah.
I think he realizes that the cost, I would hope anyway, I would think he realizes the cost of doing that changes everything. I mean, that would be a complete game changer for the U.S., for the West. I think what we could do to kind of prevent that is, should we take those threats seriously? Well, absolutely, we should think about it, but we shouldn't blink. We shouldn't always immediately say, okay, he's threatened that, so therefore we're going to back down and not provoke him again. Going back to that terminology. So I think you can do a lot of things behind the scenes. Call him behind the scenes, let it be public, and just say, this series of very bad things are going to happen to you and your country should this take place. We don't have to get into tit for tat on public television like, we are wont to do sometimes. I think we need to do a lot of things behind the scenes, but make it clear to him that's not something that we're going to tolerate.
If I could make one concept more understood in the world, I think I might choose deterrence. Lee Edwards, we're always told, often rightly, that things aren't black and white. The world is gray. There's nuance. There are subtleties. People say to me, oh, Jay, there's not good and evil. You can't have your good guys and bad guys. That's a cartoon. That's naive. You're an extremist. But Lee, I follow this thing pretty closely, done a lot of interviewing, done a lot of studying. I don't see how it gets more black and white, more clear cut, more good and evil. I personally don't see the two sides in this. I can see two sides in, for example, the Tigray horrors in northern Ethiopia, and maybe two sides in other. I don't see any two sides here. Do you? It just seems to me a freedom struggle on the part of one people against a military force trying to destroy them.
Well, I think that we could go back to Whittaker Chambers and his wonderful book, Witness, written back in the early 1950s, in which he said that the battle going on between the Soviet Union and the United States, between the free West and the communist East, is not an economic battle, that it's not a political battle. It is, in fact, a moral battle between good and evil. And he rightly, it seems to me, saw that it was the West that represented good in the classic sense, and it was the East represented by the Soviet Union, which was the evil force. And I think some of that same evil is still whirling around in the mind and in the heart of Vladimir Putin. And this is very much a battle between good and evil. And it seems to me that the American people, and that wonderful common sense way that they have, Jay, something like 60 or 70% are supporting what we're doing in Ukraine by providing those drones and javelins and the other weapons and so forth as well. The Air Force business as well. And so I think that once again, the American people are understanding things perhaps a lot better than our leadership. I wanted to say one more thing about the Russians in the question which you posed earlier, and that is, we really do know that the Russians suffered from communism, had more deaths under communism than any other people, except for the Chinese people. And we have had specific stories told about the tortures and the executions and the firing squads and the purges which went on against Russians. And we know that story through the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, through the speeches of Andrei Sakharov, and even under Mr. Yeltsin, that very flawed Russian leader. And I think we have to realize that communism came out of something far beyond just a national minority, but was in fact a worldwide global threat. We see evidence of it all over the place in places like China and Cuba, but it seems to me we also see it in what's going on in Ukraine. And I will turn to my original point and say again, I do not think that you can understand what Putin is doing and what he is trying to get the Russian people to do unless you understand that he is a creature of Marxism, Leninism.
Thank you. And Elizabeth Spalding, we have about 2 minutes. This idea of good and evil, is it too simple for you?
In the end, it is not too simple for me. We can't make good judgments in politics unless we understand what is right and what is wrong. Prudence is the highest political virtue, and it requires a knowledge of what is good. That means also you have to have a knowledge of what is not good. So I think it's not too simple. It does mean then you have to make choices, the right choices, the best choices you can make, choose well in often difficult circumstances. But these are circumstances that Putin created. These are circumstances that he decided to not distinguish between good and evil. In fact, he threw in with evil to do this. There's nothing justified about what Putin has forced his military into. And we're hearing that a lot of the military, they're not happy in the Russian military about being forced to do what they're doing. So that's another piece of this, right? And I think we've mentioned Solzhenitsyn several times. I'm thinking of his classic line about how the battle for good and evil goes through the heart of each and every individual, or paraphrase to that effect. And that's what's going on here. So you see it small in each individual, and then you see it writ large in this very conflict.
I'm so glad that the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation exists. So glad that the National Review Institute exists. Thank you to Ken Pope and Elizabeth Edwards Spalding and Lee Edwards and Lindsay Craig. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. And I look forward to our next such discussion. Maybe the news will be better, but thank you all so very much. Until next time.
Thank you.